The term banana republic gets thrown around a lot these days, especially in the world of politics. But what does it really mean? By the way it's used, it's easy to tell the people using the term don't understand its meaning. And more importantly, is it an accurate way to describe what's happening in the United States today? The original meaning of Banana Republic takes us back to the early 1900s. Imagine Central American countries, their economies completely reliant on exporting bananas. These countries were often controlled by foreign corporations who held immense power, manipulating governments and exploiting resources for their own gain. Today, the term is being used in a very different context. Right-wing groups in the US, particularly those aligned with the MAGA movement, are using it to criticize what they see as corruption and political targeting within their own government. They claim America is becoming a banana republic, but this comparison is not only inaccurate, but deeply misleading. It ignores the historical context and the vastly different realities of these situations. To understand the true meaning of a banana republic, we need to go back in time. We need to look at the history of U.S. corporate involvement in Central America, specifically the role of the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company, often called El Pulpo, or the octopus by locals, wasn't just in the business of growing bananas. This company had its tentacles wrapped around every aspect of life in countries like Honduras and Guatemala. They owned vast plantations, railroads, and shipping ports. They controlled the land, the transportation, and the means of export. This gave them unprecedented economic and political power. The United Fruit Company wasn't shy about using its power to influence governments. They demanded favorable laws and tax breaks. They interfered in elections and even orchestrated coups to install leaders who would protect their interests. Honduras became a prime example of a banana republic under the thumb of the United Fruit Company. The company's influence was so pervasive that Honduras became practically a subsidiary of the corporation. The Honduran economy became completely dependent on banana exports. This made the country incredibly vulnerable to fluctuations in the global banana market, a market controlled by the United Fruit Company. The United States government, eager to protect American business interests abroad, turned a blind eye to the company's exploitative practices. In some cases, the U.S. government even intervened directly in Honduran affairs to protect the United Fruit Company's dominance. In 1911, for example, the U.S. supported a coup that installed a pro-business government in Honduras. This ensured the United Fruit Company could continue operating with minimal interference. Guatemala tells a similar story of corporate greed and U.S. intervention. Like Honduras, Guatemala's economy was dominated by the United Fruit Company, which controlled vast swaths of land and key industries. In 1951, Jacobo Arbenz was democratically elected president of Guatemala. Arbenz, a progressive reformer, threatened the United Fruit Company's control by implementing land reforms that redistributed unused land to landless peasants. The United Fruit Company, fearing the loss of its land and profits, lobbied the U.S. government to intervene. They painted Arbenz as a communist threat, using Cold War anxieties to justify their call for action. In 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup that overthrew Arbenz and installed a military dictatorship more favorable to U.S. corporate interests. This intervention had devastating consequences for Guatemala, plunging the country into decades of civil war and instability. Now, let's compare the United States to the banana republics of the past. The first glaring difference is the structure of their economies. The U.S. boasts a diverse economy with strength in technology, manufacturing, finance, and countless other sectors. This diversity acts as a buffer, protecting the country from economic shocks that could cripple a nation reliant on a single commodity. Banana republics, on the other hand, were dangerously dependent on the export of a single product, usually bananas. This dependence made them vulnerable to price fluctuations in the global market, a market often controlled by the same foreign corporations that dominated their economies. This economic reliance on a single crop translated into political vulnerability. The corporations controlling the banana trade held significant sway over governments, dictating policies and ensuring their own continued dominance. Another fundamental difference lies in the realm of politics and governance. The U.S., despite its flaws, has a long history of democratic principles enshrined in its Constitution. Regular elections, a multi-party system, and checks and balances between branches of government are all hallmarks of a stable democracy. While the U.S. system is not without its challenges, it provides a framework for accountability and citizen participation. Banana republics, in stark contrast, were characterized by political instability, often fueled by foreign interference. Coup d'etat, rigged elections, and authoritarian regimes were commonplace, creating an environment of fear and uncertainty. The lack of stable institutions and the pervasive influence of foreign powers made it nearly impossible for these countries to establish genuine democracy and self-determination. Finally, we must consider the well-being of the people. The U.S. has a relatively high standard of living, with access to education, healthcare, and social safety nets. While disparities exist, the U.S. system, in principle, strives to provide opportunities for its citizens and protect their fundamental rights. In banana republics, the exploitation of resources and labor often went hand in hand with widespread poverty, inequality, and limited access to essential services. The majority of the population suffered while a small elite, often in league with foreign corporations, reaped the benefits. This stark contrast in social indicators highlights the fundamental difference between a nation that prioritizes the well-being of its citizens and one that prioritizes the profits of a select few. The comparison of the United States to a banana republic, especially as used by the MAGA movement, is not only inaccurate but downright dangerous. It twists the historical reality of these exploited nations and minimizes the struggles of their people. The MAGA movement, in its defense of Donald Trump and its attacks on the U.S. government, has weaponized the term banana republic to fuel a narrative of victimhood and sow distrust in democratic institutions. They claim that Trump is the victim of political persecution, that the investigations into his actions are nothing more than a witch hunt orchestrated by a deep state determined to silence him and his supporters. This rhetoric resonates with those already disillusioned with the political establishment, offering a simple explanation for complex problems and a common enemy to rally against. By drawing parallels between the U.S. and banana republics, the MAGA movement aims to discredit the very institutions that uphold democracy and the rule of law. They paint a picture of a justice system rigged against them, where political opponents are targeted and basic rights are trampled upon. This rhetoric has real-world consequences, eroding public trust in the judiciary, law enforcement, and the electoral process itself. When faith in these institutions is shaken, it becomes easier to dismiss legitimate investigations as politically motivated attacks and to justify efforts to overturn election results. This creates a dangerous climate where violence and unrest can flourish. While the U.S. is a far cry from a banana republic, the MAGA movement's rhetoric and actions reveal some disturbing parallels to the authoritarian tendencies that plague those exploited nations. The relentless attacks on the media, the judiciary, and anyone deemed critical of Trump echo the tactics used by dictators to silence dissent and consolidate power. The attempt to overturn the 2020 election results, culminating in the January 6th insurrection, was a blatant assault on the very foundation of American democracy. The willingness to subvert the will of the people and cling to power by any means necessary is a hallmark of authoritarian regimes, not healthy democracies. The MAGA movement's embrace of these tactics, however unintentional, should serve as a stark warning about the fragility of democratic institutions and the importance of safeguarding them against those who would seek to undermine them. The comparison of the United States to a banana republic, particularly in the context of defending Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, is a dangerous distortion of reality. This comparison trivializes the historical suffering of nations exploited by corporate greed and foreign interference while simultaneously undermining the very foundations of American democracy. The United States, for all its complexities and imperfections, remains a nation built on democratic principles and a diverse economy, and a commitment to the rule of law. These principles, though constantly tested, have endured for centuries, providing a framework for progress and self-governance. To equate the United States with a banana republic is not only inaccurate, but also deeply irresponsible. This comparison serves to erode public trust in the institutions that uphold democracy, fueling cynicism, and creating a climate where misinformation and extremism can thrive. It is essential to remember that words matter. The language we use shapes our understanding of the world and influences our actions. When we distort language for political gain, we undermine the very principles of truth and accountability that are essential for a healthy democracy. In an age of information overload and rampant misinformation, it is more important than ever to approach political rhetoric with a critical eye. We must be wary of simplistic narratives that reduce complex issues to catchy slogans and demonize opponents as enemies of the state. The misuse of the term banana republic is a prime example of how language can be weaponized to manipulate public opinion and advance a particular agenda. It is essential to challenge such distortions and engage in thoughtful discussions based on facts, historical context, and a nuanced understanding of the issues at hand. Instead of resorting to inflammatory comparisons, we must focus on addressing the real challenges facing our nation. This requires engaging in respectful dialogue, seeking common ground, and working together to strengthen our democratic institutions. We must hold our leaders accountable, demand transparency, and remain vigilant in defending the principles of freedom, justice, and equality that define the American experiment. Only through informed engagement and a commitment to democratic values can we ensure that the United States lives up to its ideals and continues to serve as a beacon of hope and opportunity for all. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay informed and take care of one another.